Hi everybody, welcome to part 2 of Performance Strategy Revision Program. I'm Shehan Adikari. If you can remember, I took you all through the case study analysis on the types of risks applicable for the case, and then on some insight as to how you can use your exchange rate hedging methods last week. So today we will continue with the point where we stopped. I will take you all through the interest rate derivatives, interest rate swaps to be specific, and then some more insights as to how different types of risks can get tested on your case study, and hopefully you can get some insight as to how your risks portion could get tested in your exams in PS this May. Exchange rate options, the next derivative I want to take you all through. In terms of definition, or what is an option, principally this is the same as a forward agreement. This is where you've been given a guaranteed rate. You all can take yourselves through the slide as well, but just to give you all a summary, option is where you get a principally the same outcome as the forwards. You've been given a guaranteed date on a specific date for a specific transaction value, and you can use it if you wish to use it. That's where the difference comes. Forwards, you're obliged to use it, but whereas options, you have the flexibility to use it or not. And if you think that you don't want to use option rate, if your spot rate is much more favorable, you can even think of not using it. And not using it does not mean breach of contract in this context. So that's the benefit you get from an option. Definitely no one will give you this for free, and there will be a charge, there will be a premium charge on options, and that's where it becomes a little expensive, and that's where people will always contemplate, should I should I pay a premium, or should I get myself absorbed to this charge and get an option where I get flexibility, or should I just go with the forward where I'm comfortable with more of a fixed rate. There are two types of options. One is call option, the other one is put option. What is a call option? Call option gives you the right to buy. The option holder gets the right to buy. Put option is where the option holder gets the right to sell. So at the exam, when you select which option to be used, you will be mindful as to what right you want to actually get. Whether do you want the right to sell a particular currency, or do you want the right to buy a particular currency, and depending on that you select what sort of an option you want to go ahead with. This is definitely can be a testable area, if not in the section A, can be testable in the section B, and definition should be really thorough. Otherwise if you mix it up with the call and a put option, your whole exam question will be wrong. Definitely when it comes to the disadvantaged lot, options may not be available in every currency. Options will have that premium charge. Options will bringing you that upfront payment. So you are making an upfront payment of a premium and buying an option. So your cash flows may get impacted also because you have an upfront payment. You are paying for the option for a particular transaction. The transaction may not even happen. So you are paying a premium. And sometimes you have uncertainty in terms of the transaction itself. So those are some of the drawbacks you will come across when you're using options, and these are the most frequent tested areas at the exam, and then it's just straightforward coming in from theory. You have this thing called option payoff diagrams. It's not tested very significantly at the exam, but option payoff diagrams gives an idea as to how the particular option parties would benefit out of this option they use. For example, if it's a call option, what is the call option? It gives the right to buy for the call option holder. Definitely when someone gets the right to buy, there has to be someone else who is obliged to sell. If I have a right to buy a particular currency or a particular commodity, I should be able to go and buy it from someone, meaning there is another party who is selling it to me. So that's called the call option seller. So obviously you have a call option buyer who owns the call option, who gets the right to buy a commodity or a currency, and the other party is call option seller. So you just plot a diagram as to how the profitability would vary for the call option buyer and for the call option seller against the market price fluctuation. So market price of the commodity varies, how will your profit or loss vary? That's what you call a option payoff diagram, just for your information again. Right, so interest rate swaps. Now this is of course moving into your interest rate hedging part of it. Quickly take you all through due to the limited time. I'm not going to talk about the other derivatives applicable for interest rates. You do have the interest rates forwards. You do have interest rates forwards in the form of forward trade agreements, you call it FRAs. You do have interest rate futures. You do have interest rate options. Calculations in these derivatives aren't tested that frequently as much as the other derivatives. It was not tested for a long time in CIMA in the history of P3 exam. But interest rate swap is what gets really tested. So a very important area, can be a part of your section A question as well. Now just to tell you all how will a company expose themselves to the interest rate risk, just to take you all through the basics of it. There are two types of debt. One is fixed debt, one is floating debt. Obviously fixed debt is where your interest rate is fixed, and irrespective of any market rate movements, you will be bound by a particular fixed rate. The other type of borrowing you can have is your floating rate debt. Now what is floating rate debt? That's where your debt or your periodic debt repayment, you will be bound by an interest, and that interest rate will be varying along with a reference rate. In London it's a LIBOR, London Interbank Offer Rate. In Sri Lanka you have the SLIBOR. According to the LIBORs, the EURIBORs, the SLIBORs, your repayment, your debt repayment interest would vary. So you're bound by market fluctuations. You have the pros and the cons always. If you look at on the face value itself at any given time, a floating rate debt would be relatively cheaper, because banks love to lend money at a floating rate, because they know if there's an upside movement in the interest rate, you can pass it on to your borrower. And if it's a fixed rate, you have no room to share that upside movement with the borrower. So banks love to make it more attractive for borrowers to agree upon a floating rate, and hence they make it relatively cheaper. So companies also would want to mix it up. They as a form of hedging, or sometimes they mix the fixed and the floating debt component, so that you have mitigated risk by using the fixed rate, as well as you're giving your company opportunity to get some benefit out of a interest rate downward trend as well by going for floating. So companies would mix it. So if at all a company mixes this, if at all a company is having some floating debt, they will expose themselves to an interest rate risk, and that's where interest rate hedging comes into play. And under interest rate hedging, interest rate swaps are quite popular and is testable as far as the calculations are concerned. Now what happens in an interest rate swap, I'll explain it through a small example, but principally what happens in an interest rate swap is you have two parties. For a swap to work, you need two parties with exact opposite requirements. For example, if it is an interest rate swap, you need two parties with a borrowing of the same value, a borrowing amount which is running into the same period, but they would have opposite requirements. Example, my company A, let's say, I need $10 million. I need this money for 3 years, and I prefer to have a floating rate debt. That's me. And you have another company which is having exactly the opposite requirements in terms of the interest rate. That is, I have a company B who prefers to be a fixed rate. So exactly the opposite of company A, but company B also has the exact capital requirement in terms of the borrowing amount, $10 million, and exact period, which is 3 years. So similar borrowing, similar period, but opposite requirements when it comes to the interest rate applicable. That's where you can actually devise a interest rate swap. And this, remember everybody, this will lead to the drawback itself, because if you can't find an exact match, you can't devise a swap arrangement. So that's a prerequisite for you to actually devise a swap arrangement. I will take you all through the advantages. Swapping is helping companies in so many ways. It cannot be defined as the best hedging technique, because hedging is where you completely take off risk and you're not really intending to make profits out of it, or you're not intending to make savings out of it rather. But a swap whether it's currency swap or whether it's an interest rate swap, is not really where you want to hedge. Yes, you can hedge by swapping from a floating to a fixed, you hedge yourself, but more than that, you're trying to work on synergies of two companies. There are two companies who can work together because they have the similar borrowing requirement, they have a similar time frame, and they like opposite requirements when it comes to the interest rate types. Using that synergy, you can bring the cost applicable for both the parties down. Now that's where interest rate swaps becomes really popular, and that's how the question will be framed as well. So keep in mind, it is a hedging technique. Yes, it helps you to swap from floating to fixed, but not exactly the pure meaning of hedging where you completely eliminate risk. You are looking at getting some potential savings through synergy as well. You have your drawbacks, obviously, like I told you all, not being able to find that right partner. You will have intermediaries who will make some charges. You will have doubts and you will have conflicts in sharing the gain. Gain sharing is a popular thing in the world, but how do you share the gain? What percentage will be shared? Depends on how powerful each party is in terms of bargaining power. So those things are the inherent drawbacks of the swap arrangement. I will take you all through the swap calculations right after this break. Hi, welcome back everybody. I will take you all through a small example on interest rate swaps, just for you all to understand how the calculation works out here. If you can follow the screen, it says company A and B is in need of borrowing $10 million for a period of 3 years for their investment needs. So the borrowing amount is equal, the time frame is equal. The borrowing costs applicable for both the parties. They've given you the fixed and the floating rates. So you can see for company A, the interest rates are relatively low. This is where you see the company A having a better bargaining credit power, and definitely they have better bargaining credit power whether it's floating or whether it's a fixed market. And company B is relatively less in power in terms of their credit bargaining power. They say company A prefers floating debt as opposed to company B, who prefers a fixed rate debt, devise a swap arrangement. So they have given the preference of the two companies as well. So this is the theory this is the thought process rather, which goes into defining a swap arrangement, or why this whole swap was brought into this world. How we will look into this is, if you see, this is the rates applicable. I'm just taking the same table over here, and we said, if you go back to the question quickly, that company A prefers to be a floating debt pair and company B prefers fixed. So I will take a scenario where A goes on his own and B goes on his own and borrow on their own, right? This is the first scenario. If the companies borrow on their own, A preferred to be a floating, B preferred to be a fixed, and they'll go and borrow at LIBOR plus 3 and 10.5%. That's the applicable rates for them. I will do a simple calculation and see if these two companies go on their own, what would be their total cost, because the same borrowing amount, what would be the total interest cost of company A plus B, and that comes up to L plus 13.5. It's a straightforward calculation. Now I can take a slightly different stance. I see, when I look at the data, even though A prefers to be a floating, A is the guy who's having a better bargaining power, and A prefers to be a floating. Now, even though A prefers to be a floating, A has a better bargaining power or better saving in the fixed market. If you see, in the fixed market, the applicable interest rates for A is 7.5, whereas applicable interest for B is 10.5. So he is having a better margin or better saving in the fixed market. The saving, or you call it the comparative advantage in the fixed market, is 3%. He is 3% better in fixed, and is only 2% better in floating. So what's happening here is that we know A has a better comparative edge in the fixed market, but he prefers to be a floating pair, right? And that's why the total cost has come up to now L plus 13.5. Now in this scenario, what would happen is company A could go or company A and B rather can get together and think like this. Company B can tell you, company A, look, you are really good in the fixed market. You have a better advantage than me in the fixed market. Why don't you go and borrow in the fixed market? I will go and borrow in the floating market, even though we have opposite requirements. I will go and borrow in the floating market, and then we will swap between each other. So you go and borrow in the fixed market where you're better. I will go and borrow in the floating market where I would say I'm less in the bargaining power, but I'm not as bad as fixed. I am 2% bad in floating, I'm 3% bad in fixed. I'll go and take the 2% bad, so I'm not that bad. So B will say, A, you go and borrow in the fixed market, I will go and borrow in the floating market, and later on we will swap. Now just see how the calculation goes. If they do it this way, if A goes and exploit his power in the fixed market and tell B, on behalf of me, you go and borrow in the floating market, you will see the total cost has come down now to how much? L plus 12.5. So the total cost applicable for both the parties has now come down by 1%. This is again, both the parties could benefit out of this synergy, and that's what you actually bring out of a swap. Apart from definitely minimizing risk, you can swap from a floating to a fixed, that is anywhere there, but these I'm talking about the financial saving both these parties could get. So you will see there is a gain of 1%, and in scenarios where they don't specify, generally gain is shared half, 50-50. Let's assume you're sharing the gain 50-50, meaning both the parties should gain 0.5 through this swap arrangement. I hope you understand how the calculational effects is helping them to understand that there's a possibility of taking a gain, and they're leveraging on the synergy to get some benefit out of this. So you see there's a gain available of 1%, and now we will see how we can actually pass this benefit on to these two companies and how the internal payments will happen, and that's what you call the swap agreement as well. So you do a calculation, this should be your final cost after the swap. Without the swap arrangement, A would have had a cost of L plus 3. This is A preferred to be a floating pair. If he had gone on his own, he would have had a cost of L plus 3. If B had gone on his own, he would have had a cost of 10.5. But now you see there's a swapping happening, you borrow it the other way around, you could get a gain of 0.5, meaning they should finally end up at 0.5 less than what they could have got if they had gone on their own. That's the argument. So without the swap, A would have ended up at L plus 3, B would have gone for 10.5, but with the swap they should get a 0.5 benefit for both of them. So they should end up at L plus 2.5 and 10% after the swap is done. If that doesn't happen, then no point. So they are getting a benefit, and they are getting what they actually wanted as well, the preferred form of borrowing. So how do you make this happen? This is how you think on this lines. This was the outcome, this should be the final outcome, right? I will take what you should do to create the swap. For you to create the swap, this is how you should use your bargaining powers. I told you all, A has to go and exploit the benefit he has in this fixed market. So he has to go and borrow at 7.5, and B has to do the other way around, even though the preference lies the opposite way. So A will have to go and borrow in the fixed, B will have to go and borrow in the floating, just to facilitate this whole swap arrangement. And this is what we'll do. So A, B, two parties, A will have to go and borrow at 7.5 in the fixed market, and B will have to go and borrow at L plus 5. Why? To facilitate this swap arrangement only. But what should be the final outcome? If you see the table on top, the final outcome should be A should end up being a LIBOR plus 2.5, because that was their preference, and when you apply the gain of 0.5%, A should end up at L plus 2.5. So at the moment he will go and borrow externally using his fixed market where he has a better power, but he wants to end up, the final outcome should be L plus 2.5. So now what will happen is, these two companies will make intercompany payments to each other to actually get this final outcome. What's the easiest way calculationally to do this? You pick the company who wants to be the floating pair, and he has to have a L payment anyway. And who should be that company? It's company A, because company A wants to finish as the floating pair. So put the L payment from A to B. So A will now start paying a L rate to B, and he becomes automatically a floating pair. Now you have balanced it off by bringing the L intercompany L transaction, nothing to do with external parties. A will pay L, okay? Now to figure out the balancing amount, you can look at from either company's perspective. If I look at the A's perspective, at the moment A has a cost of L, A has another cost of 7.5, his total cost has now come to L plus 7.5. But his final outcome should be LIBOR plus 2.5, meaning from an L plus 7.5 he should come down to L plus 2.5. How can that happen? There has to be a payment of 5% to him so that it will come down to L plus 2.5, and that's where. So once the 5% payment comes from B to A, you will eventually get the final outcome the two companies desired, and then you will see there is a 0.5 benefit coming into both the parties as well. And if you look at from a perspective of company B, you will see they are making an L plus 5 to an external party, they are receiving L from A, so L and L gets netted off. 5 plus the 2.5% they pay to A becomes the final. 5 plus 5% they pay to A becomes the final cost, and their total cost again eventually comes to 10%. So finally what happened was, just to summarize, there were two companies. They could have borrowed on their own, but they got together, worked on their synergies. There was one company who had a better comparative edge, and then he exploited that edge to pass on some synergies to both the parties. That's how an interest rate swap works, and this is how generally the calculations are carried on in interest rate swaps. So that's about the discussion on some derivatives. We'll go for a short break. Once we come back from the break, I will take you all again through some of the types of risks, continuing from the financial risks part of it, and then moving on to legal, compliance, operational, and some other supply chain risks involved pertaining to the case study of May 2014. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I will now take you all through legal and compliance risk again pertaining to the case study of company P. What are the legal and compliance risks? Now this is the big buzz in the world, compliance, how compliant companies are, different standards being applied, and especially the European and the American consumers being more bothered about how compliant a company is more than the price or whatever the services a company could offer, because that's anyway a given in this competitive world. So compliance is playing a vital role, especially in the Western and the European sector in this world. Coming up to the whole point of legal and compliance risk, the international nature of P's operation will definitely expose them to a great legal or litigation risk for them. They'll be buying from various suppliers across the world, they'll be selling it to various consumers and agents across the world, and definitely you'll be bound by lots of laws and regulations and compliance of each and every part of the world they're working in. So definitely this can be a thing which can get tested in your case studies, and you will have to have a thorough knowledge, because unless you are working in an environment like that, or unless you've been exposed to a certain scenario like that, you might not really have the experience to talk about it at the exam. So that's one point for you to keep in mind. Litigation could arise as a result of worker compensation. It can be in the form of worker violation. It can be in the form of labor or employer liabilities. It can be in the form of the product liability itself. This product can cause damages, and that can lead to a certain penalties being paid. It can be in the form of environmental damage. So this is a hot topic in the world. How friendly are you with the environment and the use of different chemicals? For an example, big brands like the Marks and Spencers, the Gaps, the Victoria's Secrets are very scared about the types of chemicals their suppliers are using. So across the value chain, they're really bothered as to how use of chemicals is done. Just a simple example, tell you all how bothered companies and major brands are in terms of compliance with regard to environmental. So this being another product which is manufactured, where it is manufactured in, and what compliance are they following, can be another form which can get tested in this particular case study. Another simple example, I'm sure you would have heard about this, the asbestos issue in the UK, and then how compliance were driven and how seriously UK authorities had taken this. And then obviously asbestos again could be a part of their product portfolio, being a company selling building materials, plumbing materials, etc., could be a part of their product portfolio, and how will they drive compliance is another aspect to consider as well. Another aspect could be the case study emphasized on the fact that they will be driving their own labels. It's two different things. One is you source from a supplier who is manufacturing and then selling, so you become your distributor, or you could outsource manufacturing but sell it through your own brand. And when you do that, you have more responsibility, because now it's your own brand, your reputation is at stake. Whatever the claims which would come in your way, you will be liable as well. So it could actually aggravate the problem of legal and compliance risk for this company. What are the steps this company could take to avoid or mitigate these risks? Levels of litigation must be monitored by individual business units and by PE's legal department as well, and a comprehensive liability insurance program is maintained, and insurance policy terms, conditions are defined properly and reviewed accordingly. It's very important. Insurance plays a vital role. How do you cover yourself? This is passing risk from your party to another party. How do you pass that risk, and how do you ensure that that is actually covered? We should monitor ongoing product litigation related issues and then keep a track of what's happening with the current litigations to ensure certain activities are done properly. The quality assurance of the procedures you take should be taken care of, just to ensure that things don't go wrong in the process of doing this exercise. In special cases, employee independent professional advisors may need and may actually determine the potential gross liability as well. So how will you use consultants, how will you use these services to ensure that you are estimating the liabilities properly? And you all have seen now the latest issue with the MH370 flying, going missing, how corporates are reacting to that, how insurance companies would get involved here. That's what is tested. And my advice for you all as PA students, I'm sure you all don't have much time for the exam by the time you see this video, but keep your eyes open and see how things are happening in the world and how you can relate those corporate examples to your case study. Don't be afraid to write, what you hear and see in the news, what you hear in the corporate, what you hear in the Bloombergs or the Harvard Business Reviews, because that's what will actually help you to score some marks. So again, people, that's why I'm just trying to relate it to your case studies as well and see how well you can apply your practical knowledge into this. Amount insured by P must significantly exceed the estimated liability relating to the claims. Now this is this predictive analysis companies are using. Can you estimate the exposure to the liabilities, and will you insure for that amount as well? Because for them, insurance is not only about product liability but can be in the form of logistics, because they are into the distribution business. Maybe something can happen while they are transporting goods. So all these aspects covered in your insurance is another question you can always ask yourself, which can get tested as well. Right, so next, coming to operational risks. Now this could be another important point, how operations can get disrupted. Just to give you a definition, it's a very broad definition when you say operations risk, but this is where you talk about how disruptive certain actions, certain occurrences could be on your day-to-day operations, and that's where we will talk about various aspects. It could be on the form of employee, it could be on the form of supply chain, it could be on the form of sales, whatever it is. Under that I can talk about employee retention risk. Now employees are an integral part of this company, and if you look at the vision of this company, they always mention on the very first phase of the case study the fact that they are a company who believes in retention of employment, the development of the employees, etc., etc. So that if they are bound by these visions, it's very important that you keep them happy and keep them motivated as well. And definitely, like I told you before, you always take the fact that this is a generic business. Everyone can do this business. So how do you remain competitive is a very key question you can ask yourself, and that can be a testable point at the exam. And that one differentiator could be the skill of the staff, and then how do you retain this skill is another question. How do you increase productivity? How do you give them growth opportunities? How can you shuffle people, because you're working across regions? How do you shuffle? You can use a little bit of your HR knowledge you have gathered in your enterprise operations pillar, and if you can bring that into the answer, that's where you score marks. Don't limit yourself to what you studied and the tunes you have for PO. Use your knowledge you have gathered across your CIMA studies and maybe in your personal experiences as well. So development of the existing employees, how do you reshuffle them, can be another answer which you could propose. Then definitely, guys, is another problem which we also face in the Sri Lankan context. The moment difficult times comes, the moment a recession comes, the first thing is you cut cost. And how do you cut cost? The first option you have is to cut down on people. You can, through a redundancy program or whatever, a voluntary retirement scheme, or in any form, you try to cut down on the job opportunities and then curtail on that cost. So how effectively will you do that? Sometimes it comes to a dire need that you have to do this, but how effective would that be, and how will you ensure that staff doesn't become demotivated? Because general norm is, if there's a redundancy program done, it definitely leads to dissatisfied bunch of staff. So how do you minimize that risk? All the action you can take should monitor voluntary labor turnover. So labor turnover is another KPI you can always keep on tracking to see how employees are moving out, what are their performance evaluation measurements. These are very generic, so you must be thinking, why am I talking about this? I'm talking about performance strategy. I have studied internal control and audit. I have studied interest rates. So what is this question? That's where the differentiator comes. I'm sure if you're a person who is sitting for the second or third time, you would have gone through this experience. It's a very, very general paper in most cases, and ensure that your mind is open enough to use your simple definitions, simple answers to write a decent answer. So things like monitoring the KPIs in terms of a turnover, in terms of an evaluation, could help you to assess this risk more effectively. Succession plan, very, very important, from at the top level to the very bottom, who would succeed, because these are regional products. You might need regional knowledge, you might need product specific knowledge, which could be quite difficult to find also if someone quickly goes off. And then how are you planning yourself to manage that risk? So do you have a succession plan? Do you have a bunch of people who can replace the senior guys at any cost? Is something you can always look in, and this is simple risk mitigation for an organization. Like I told you, career mobility is another thing you can always propose, so the people would get more exposure, they will feel that they themselves are developed as well, and this would definitely lead to a scenario where you have a motivated bunch of staff, which could help you to somehow manage this risk of employee retention. Next big risk is IS and IT infrastructure risk. This is stemming from your topic of information system risk management, which is a good 20-25% of your syllabus. There's a lot of technical areas involved in this. I'm not going to take you all to the technical areas, but I want to talk about the application of this risk in the context of company P, which I will do right after this break, so stay tuned. Hi everybody, welcome back. So talking about IS/IT infrastructure and risk management in this case, definitely you all know from most companies in the world, IS or information systems and the technology they use becomes their competitive edge as well, with the use of different supplier portals, the use of different EDI systems in the world. It actually helps them companies to become much more competitive, and then the more you become superior in technology, the more benefits you can always reap out, and then you can pass it on to your customers as well. So it's a very important aspect of this company. It could be the heart of the company as well, and if the IS/IT infrastructure has some problem, you might even face the risk of the entire operation being halted. So it's very, very critical for a company, especially a distribution company who is simply working on customer orders and getting it delivered through suppliers. It's like Amazon.com. Amazon cannot run without the Amazon website, because that's the portal where people order, people get the goods delivered, and you connect your customer and the supplier. So if you can't connect it, your execution of the whole process will be a failure. So it's very, very, very critical. So P can only carry on the business as long as it has a proper infrastructure, and the infrastructure is actually bound to have problems, have threats because of various reasons. It can be due to the fact that the physical infrastructure itself could get damaged through various natural disasters or whatever. Servers could go wrong. There could be viruses. There could be security threats. You can be having the hackings, etc., etc. You can have your systems going down due to overload. You can have natural disasters, like I said. So it can be tangible. It can be intangible disasters your systems could go through. Now, why is it critical? Sometimes most companies, in the case of P also that could be the case, bulk of the revenue now, even for great big companies who've been using physical retail stores to do business, now they're seeing that more of their businesses are now moving into e-commerce businesses. So they sell more online than what they sell in the physical retail stores. So if that's the context of the company, losing out on the infrastructure of IT will actually trigger a significant risk. And then assets could be exposed, and then when it comes to infrastructure assets, IT assets, this exposure can lead to natural disasters impacting your IT infrastructure as well. So how do you manage this risk? Disaster recovery plan, these are pure theories you are learning in PS. How do you use a disaster recovery plan to ensure that if something goes wrong, what will you do? There have been so many questions in the past tested on this whole disaster recovery plan context, and how well you can prepare your organization to manage a disaster. How do you do a simulation? How effectively can you do a simulation to see, in the case of a disaster, how well you can really use your disaster recovery management plan. If you talk about real theory again, they should actually implement the IT governance framework. How well you govern your IT infrastructure? What are the policies deployed? How will you control your IT security? How do you bring in the internal control team, your chief security officer into this? And how do you ensure that compliance is enforced in the company? Same point again. Formal documents of the test plans, continuous review of whatever the routine tests you are doing, etc. could be another factor which you can bring in to ensure that surprises are not there in the company. Internal controls, again, like I discussed, how well you can enforce internal controls to ensure that these risks are mitigated, and that's in terms of the IT risks part of it. So finally, we're coming into supply chain risk. So this again, gentlemen and ladies, this could be a big factor in your question, because this company is actually a supply chain company. This is where they buy from some place, some vendors, and then they bring it to a centralized warehouse, logistic warehousing, and then they redistribute again to the final consumer. So this is a simple supply chain company, and supply chain risk could be a very, very huge factor in this. So being one of the largest networks of distribution of this building peripherals and the computer, the maintenance and the plumbing equipment, etc. It's, if you think in simple, it's small items. So the SKU levels will be huge, right? You will be talking about thousands and thousands of SKUs of units, and the value of each purchase order can be very small, right? So that's the type of business you are looking at, and how do you manage a supply chain is a big issue always. You can define supply chain risk in terms of the supplier himself. How do you ensure that the supplier is the right guy you're talking about? Again, you can link compliance, etc. to this. How do you ensure that the selection of the supplier is done? And if you work with the wrong supplier, you will actually face big issues. How do you ensure that your logistics will be smooth enough to bring down your costs? How do you ensure that the logistics doesn't lead to any delays? All these things will be a part of your supply chain risks. Moving on, guys. Speed is the next big thing. Why Zara is so popular in this world is because of the speed model they have brought in, and that has really killed the apparel market. And actually it's a new page in the apparel industry in the world, which Zara built on by their speed model. So how can you enable your supply chain to facilitate this speed? I'm sure you would have heard Amazon is now looking at various types of predictive sales. If you're a consumer, when you're lingering on the website, when you're looking at a product, Amazon thinks that you will buy it and they will deliver it to that particular country or the continent. They are that agile in terms of the supply chain. So these are different things companies do to ensure that they become much more competitive and reduce time to the market, offer speed. Through that speed, they can actually become the differentiator. So speed is another thing. Lack of speed can lead to disruptions, can lead to you becoming uncompetitive, which is a risk. So those are the things. If you talk about risks, and then what are the other supply chain related risks? You can have the political risks, right? Because you are buying from, I'm just extending the supply chain risk part of it again. You're buying from various countries, you're bound by their laws, you're bound by the changes of the laws, and you will face a political risk when the political parties changes or whatever it is. You're just extending that risk again. Currency risk, like we discussed initially also. Cyber attacks in terms of the information flow. EDI, the electronic data interchange, is very important in this context of a supply chain company. And a lot of cyber attacks, it can be the network going down, it can be virus threats or whatever, which can disrupt the information flow and which will just simply disrupt the whole flow of the organization. Failing of communication with the suppliers, again a similar point. And then strikes, this is again civil unrest at the port of delivery or at the port of the pickup, and then that might simply lead to a huge disruption in your company. Property related issues, you can have natural disasters. They're talking about one single warehouse, right, in US and Europe, and you're looking at significant volume being transacted in this warehouse. So what if this warehouse goes on fire? Simple question. And what are the aspects you will face here, and how badly it will hit you if something small goes wrong in that warehouse, because you're more talking of more centralizing, and the diversification of the storing is not there in this context. Or it could be the accidents, right? Like I told you, it can be a small explosion. This happened to British Petroleum. You all know the explosion. It caused various problems from compliance to environmental, everything. But more than anything, it caused disruption to the existing operations of British Petroleum. So those are some of the extended risks of supply chain. Now, how do you prevent your risks in supply chain? How do you ensure that these doesn't occur? Should take time. Number one, I'm talking more from a supplier end here. Supplier risk management. The company should definitely take well time off to understand the key products, who are the key suppliers, what drives the revenue, how does the onboarding of a supplier happens, what are your key locations, right, and ensure that you mitigate risk in all these aspects, from a supplier point of view, from a location point of view, from a mode of transportation point of view. Every aspect needs to get covered here to ensure that you don't really expose yourself to a great deal of supply chain risk. The next step should be, we should identify the events that could occur and what are the possible disruptions. You call it risk identification, and you can actually extend this to a level of developing a risk matrix. You have the impact and the probabilities. You can plot it wherever you want in the grid and understand what are the big risks you are talking about. And step 3 obviously is to take preventive measurements. If supplier per se is a risk, what are the criteria you will look into when you onboard a new supplier? What are the informations you will look into? Is he technically capable? Can he supply in a peak season? Will he have any issues with using banned chemicals, etc., whatever? And are you following a process where you are inquiring about it at the time of onboarding a supplier? No point taking a supplier on board and then looking into that fact, because he is already supplying it and consumers are ordering from him as well. So you rather have a process, rather have that internal control at the inception itself. Small things, right? But these are these actually what matters in a company's context and in a corporate context as well. So this is again on the safety standards, the ethical standards, work hour violation, child labor, whatever it is from a supplier's end, and how do you ensure that those compliances are not really gone against. Controlling supply chain disruptions, again fires, right? Do you have the fire extinguishers? Do you have the right exists? You all know what happened at Rana Plaza in Bangladesh and how Walmart and the key brands in the world suffered because of that, because their supplier weren't compliant enough, and then that disruption caused delivery issues as well as compliance issues also. How do you ensure that those are addressed? Contact with the supplier, the relationship with the supplier, it can go to that level. How well you are managing the relationship you have with your supplier as well, and what is your business continuity plan? If something goes wrong, if your warehouse catches on fire, what's your plan B? Do you have a plan B to switch to? Do you have a sub warehouse? You will have backup warehouses. Those are the things you will need to concentrate on when you suggest an answer in terms of supply chain risk management. So very, very critical category to look into, especially when you talk about risk management in the context of company P. A small question to quickly sum up this revision program on this case study P, company P, and then how risk management can get tested in this examination. That just a question as is discussed in the case. P is exposed to multitude of risk. P currently has an enterprise-wide risk management program. The board feels that the enterprise risk management program needs to get restructured to meet the global challenges, and then you are now a consultant. You're supposed to tell them how do you run this enterprise-wide risk management program. What are the key aspects you should cover to run an enterprise risk management program? What are the aspects? I'm just taking you all through some quick points. Obviously, you need to add more depth to this when you're writing an answer. Number one, a critical point in running an enterprise-wide risk management program is, number one, is that it has to be a top-down approach. The blessings, the direction should come from the top itself, from the director board itself. So the ownership should be taken by the board. Now, if you look at the case study, you will see directors are there for procurement, directors are there for finance, for HR, but there's no particular director who is responsible for risk, right? And that's a little surprising also, being a large organization. And if that's the case, will a direction from the board level come is a question. So should a person be appointed, should even a non-executive director should be appointed or should be made responsible for risk is another question you can obviously ask. So this direction should come from the chairman and from the NEDs who are really focused on compliance, who are focused on risk management, to ensure that there's blessings, there's direction from the top management itself, so that risk management could be a top-down approach which could cascade along the hierarchy. So that's number one. Number two is, once a director is responsible from the board level, there has to be someone from the group level, a senior manager sort of a role, who will be responsible and driving the risk, like a chief risk officer for an example, who will drive the risk mitigation processes, who will do the risk identification. He will have the risk register, the risk matrices, keep a track of the progress of the risk management, risk mitigation plans, etc., etc. And he can have some more managers reporting to him as well. So you're initially talking about how the structure should be set for an enterprise-wide risk management process. So initially talk about the structure. Should be supported by the top management, should cascade down. You should have a middle manager to run the whole process, and then probably subordinates reporting to him on each geography or each SBU wise or whatever it is. Then moving on to the policies. Now structure is fine, Then from the director itself, a policy should be enforced, and the policy should actually keep a track of what risks should be looked into, what are the internal controls. This could be done in conjunction with the internal auditor, with the audit committee as well, to ensure that the financial risks are mitigated. But the other risks, the operational, the supply chain risks, you have to ensure that you have a proper policy, and the policy deployment is the next step when it comes to enterprise-wide risk management progress. Risk should be categorized, and now I'm going into the nitty-gritties of it. This is up to you, depending on the time available and depending on how much of depth you want to build into this. You can go into the details. You can classify it, you can categorize it, you can put all risks to one basket if you think that they are similar in nature. If you think that you need more attention, you can categorize it as the preferred or the high risks areas, etc., etc., so that you will not spend time looking into hundreds and thousands of risks, but you would have filtered as to what the most important risks are. That's in terms of the risk categorization. Consolidation of risk assessment at the group level, it's very important, because such a big organization, what happens is risk management, if it's done in isolation, each SBU, each region, if they are doing risk management, that activity won't be that efficient. So can you consolidate, can you cascade it up to a corporate level or to a group level and do that exercise across the group, so you can benefit out of the synergies you can build into the whole process. Again, I'm going into the implementation aspect of it now. A quarterly risk reporting cycle, so this is where your reporting comes into play. Now governance is fine, implementation is okay. Now how do you report, how do you keep a track of it? So you can suggest a quarterly. If you don't like quarterly, it can be monthly, more of a periodic reporting cycle, and who is responsible for that and who will keep on tracking the progress of it as well. And then finally, reporting by the chairman of the risk committee to the board, or it can be through the audit committee to the board, to keep them updated as to how the risks are looked into and how it will align with the corporate future strategy as well. So that's how generally an enterprise-wide risk management process is deployed. So when you're writing the answer, also spend a little time understanding how to structure it. Just don't go and start writing just by whatever is flowing to your mind, but structure it. Right, have that structure. I'll talk about the governance first, I'll talk about the implementation first, and then I'll talk about the reporting first, because that's how a real company would work. Just an example as to how you should devise an answer at the exam, and a little thought into this case study as well. So we come to the conclusion of the revision program. I hope I was able to give you all some insight as to what the case study is expecting out of you all, and how you can use some of the derivatives at the exam as well, and in terms of the possible risks and the possible questions the examiner might throw at you at the exam. Simple, the small advice and the only advice I can give you all at the exam is be very general. Write your personal experiences if you have been working for a company, because that's where sometimes I've met so many students who think that you should not write it. I've met people who've headed audit departments who struggled sometimes to get decent marks. Why? Because he thinks I shouldn't write it because it's something general, everybody knows this, so why should I bother write? Don't do that. You assume that the examiner doesn't know anything. Write as much as possible, go to the basics and make it very general. You should be able to score good marks and somehow pass this exam. So all the very best. Hope this was beneficial for you all. Thank you for your time. All the best.